welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Resurrected. I wanted to apologize for the gap in uploads. I've had some things come up with family and work that have made it so that I was unable to do my projects and various things like that. So thank you for sticking around and coming back. What I'm going to be working on today is I've got a terrarium stand which will be the same size as an aquarium stand. So I want to make sure it's good and strong. But before I get to that, I want to remind you to click that subscribe button so that you're notified of future content. Hit that bell icon so you get notified. And we want to get up to our 1,000 subscribers as well as the view time, but I think if the subscribers get there, the view time won't be suffering, and we'll be able to utilize that as well to get monetized, so I can get more funds put into various projects and get more shown to you guys, so that you guys can either do them at home, or you can potentially order them in the future depending on where I go with Wood Resurrected. But I want to thank you for viewing beforehand, and let's get started on this. So as you can see here, we got our wood selected for our project. What we're going to do is cut it down to approximate length first, so that we're not wasting any wood, because what I'm going to do first is I'm going to try to smooth the surfaces and take the sides down, because we're going to be using these 2x4s. So it's going to be dimensional 2x4s that we're going to take down to about 3 inches wide and about 1.25 inches thick. So we're going to have to do some planing to get it down there, as well as trim the sides off, because if you've dealt with 2x4s enough, you know that they are rounded on the ends, and we don't necessarily want that. The pickiness of this project kind of allows me some freedom as far as joints and the shape, condition of the wood itself. This is more or less going to just be a frame, and then if they want at a later date, we can go through and put surface four-side wood around, wrap it around the frame so that it looks good, maybe put some cabinet doors on it if they wanted that. But for now, all they want is a frame, something they can put stands on for their reptiles. So like I said, first thing we're going to do is we're going to start cutting everything down, and we're going to plane it.
Alright, so pretty much right out of the gate, this project kind of fights me tooth and nail. You'll see it kicks back on me here, and it does it a couple times when we're cutting these down to approximate length. And like I said, we're just doing approximate length so that after we plane them and get them ripped down to the dimensions that we want, we can potentially cut off a little bit of the snipe that occurs when we do the planing. So I think the only issue that I was having here was that I was pushing too much on the outsides instead of pushing in the center, which was causing the board to kind of grab the blade and causing the kickback for the most part. So we'll just buzz through here and get through the cross-cut portion and get down to where everything's approximate length, and then we can switch over to planing. So with the planing, I've got it set up on this woodworking bench that I built in a previous episode. I believe it's titled Woodworking Bench, and you can check that out and how I built that. And this has saved me so much bending and squatting and having to do things on the floor, things like that. That it's just been a great help as far as my woodworking has gone. But you can see I got the planer set up here, and it's got the exhaust chute on it with the shop vac attached to that. So this planer doesn't have a built-in fan to expel the wood shavings, but I've got the shop vac attached here, and once I got the issues worked out, it didn't work too bad at all. And initially it had the hose was clogged on the shop vac, and I didn't know that. It wasn't clogged completely, so there was still suction, but I just didn't notice that there wasn't enough or as much as I needed. So I had to clear that out at one point, and then because you don't actually see the wood shavings, it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind kind of deal. and this is only a 5-gallon shop vac. And what happened at one point is the shop vac gets backed up, and because it's full, and you can see there's just wood shavings all around the planer, so that's kind of what happened there. And so these are the long boards for the stand that I'm running through the planer here, and you can see I'm putting a board in front of them just to alleviate the snipe. And the reason I'm not using one on the back side is because I've found that if I lift up on the board as it exits the planer, it almost alleviates the snipe on the back end completely. So that's the reason I'm doing it that way. And I'm just running the 4 long boards, and then these 2 shorter boards are for a middle shelf. So you'll see how those are used at a later date. And I'm running these back to back because they're a little bit shorter. And then after these, I'm going to run the short ones that'll be the vertical supports for the stand. And those I just run back to back to back to back. And I let those run off the table onto the floor. We're not down to final length, so I'm going to be able to trim some of the ends off, and I'm not entirely worried about a little bit of dented corner, things like that. So here you can see there's still a little bit of shavings that are left over because I haven't figured out that the hose is partially clogged. So I'm going to fast forward this for a little bit, and we'll get through this a little faster, and you'll see that I run these boards through, and what I'm doing is I'm organizing them on the back side in an order that I can take off of the surface that I want to, because these are rounded, so I want to take that rounded edge off, and I want to take about the same amount off of both sides and get them nice and square. And then we can go from there and we can rip them down. So we're just gonna speed through here and we'll get on to the ripping process. Alright, so before I run them through and try to rip them with the table saw, we want to have at least one smooth, flat edge to run against the fence. So I'm going to take all of these boards, including the verticals, the sides, all the pieces that we're going to use. I'm going to run through here and joint one side down so it's smooth and flat, and then we're going to switch over and we're going to run through the table saw, and we're going to run through the table saw twice. So we're basically going to joint for the initial surface, then we're going to go over, run it through the table saw and take one side off. Then we're going to go back and we're going to joint the side that we ran through the table saw, so that one's nice and smooth and flat. And then we're going to go through the table saw and we're going to rip the other side off and take it down to the 3 inches that we want. And then we're going to joint that again so it's nice and smooth. So basically, in order to accomplish this, I'm not worried about the material I'm taking off initially, because I'm just joining this side. And then during that first pass through the rip, I think I had it set for like 3 and it was over 3 1/8. I think it was closer to 3 1/4. Just enough to take the edge off the other side. And then after I jointed that side, I set the table saw to about 3 and I think it was 3 1/16. And then when I ran it through the jointer after that, to smooth that surface again, I took a 1/16 off, and because it's already straight from the table saw, all I want to do is take the rough edge off from the table saw blade, and that takes the 1/16 off and takes us right down to our final dimension, which is 3 inches. So here I'm fast forwarding through this, and you can kind of see the rotation back and forth. So that's how we get down to the final dimension of 3 inches, and then both sides are smooth as well. So now that we have everything planed down to our 1 1/4 depth, and we have everything ripped down to 3 inches, and all 4 sides are planed smooth. We are ready to cut down to our final dimensions. So all I'm doing here is I got the table saw set up, and for the longer boards I basically just marked out where I needed and then used the square to draw a line across there, and then I'm just cutting along that line. For the shorter boards I do end up using a fence and the miter gauge so that I can push them through and make sure they're square. Some of them I do end up squaring the end first that's going to be against the fence. And then once the end is square, then I'll switch sides and I'll go between the fence and the blade with the miter gauge, and we'll get everything squared up and cut down to the length that we want for our final dimension. So it was after this process that I took a little break and I was discussing things with family, and I realized that I had shorted myself two of the boards that I had out in my design that I had completely left out of the initial process. So I had to go back to the beginning and find a couple of boards that we wanted to use. I had to plane them down, and I also had to run them through and joint them and rip them down to the 3 inches we wanted, so on and so forth. Basically the entire process that I did with all the others. So this just goes to show you that even though you're well prepared, sometimes your human nature kicks in and you'll forget a couple things and have to bite the bullet and go back and do it again. And in this case, that's exactly what I had to do. So I had to set the joiner up. Excuse me, I had to set the planer up, and I got it set up just where I had the table. I just threw it up there real quick. It's only 2 boards, just ran everything through, set the shopsmith back up and ran everything through there, and then got back to the stage that I was at as far as ripping things, cross-cutting things down to the final length, and then we could get back on track. And here we are. So the next step is we're going to glue the top and the bottom of the stand together. It's going to be the 2 long boards, and then it's going to have 3 cross members that hold it together. So I'm basically just measuring out the center portion where that center support's going to go, because that's also going to have verticals on top of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue the bottom, the top, and then the middle shelf together, and then from there we can do our mortise joints, and we can do our tenons as well, and that way we can get those set up. So when I cut the vertical supports, I made each one an inch longer than the final dimension actually needed to be, and that's because a ½ inch of each end is going to go into one of the shelves or the top, depending on where it's located. So that's why I left those a little bit long. So here we're just going to go through, and I'm going to go through this, and we're going to get the gluing process done so you can see the next stage. So here I'm set up to do the tenons for the mortise and tenon joints, and I don't have a dado blade for my table saw, so I've kind of always done it with just running it through multiple passes with the table saw, and it's been kind of spotty results, so I thought I'd try something a little different. So I've got the various boards that we have here that are going to have mortise and tenon joints. So I'm going to do the tenons on them, and what I've got is I've got one board across all of them, and they're clamped down, and I figured I'd go across them and use that clamp board as a support for this part of the process, and then I could just run down and I could go through all the boards and then flip them all over, do the same process, and then stand them on the sides and take those off. What I wanted to end up with was I had to take about, because they're 1.25 inches thick, I wanted to take about 3/8 of an inch off of each side, which would leave me a 1/2 inch in the center, and then obviously 3/8 off of the ends as well. Well, this didn't quite work out the way I wanted to, and you can kind of see here that some of the boards started to move, and because of the way I was doing it, it wasn't clamping all the boards down, and instead of trying to shim it and make the process a lot more convoluted than it needed to be, I ended up just taking it down to 2 boards at a time and then doing it that way. So granted, it took a little bit longer than a lot longer actually than I was hoping for, and it was after this process that I ended up getting a rabbit bit from Home Depot that actually had a bearing on it, and it was a 1/2 inch, I believe. No, I'm sorry. It's a 1/2 inch deep, potentially, and 3/8 in, which technically would have been pretty much perfect for what I was going to use them for. So, kind of live and learn. That's kind of the process that I tried. You don't know until you try. It's the way I look at it. So I definitely will be looking into getting a dado bit in the future, and from there, this process should be a lot easier. I can just run them through the table saw and get my mortise and tenons done that way. So this is just the tenon portion, and we'll go through here, and you'll see my setup for the mortise process. So here I got some boards set up with another board on top as a guide for the router, and this will allow me to do the mortise joints, and I've got a line drawn in here that shows the center and then a line on either end so that I can set the length of the mortise so that I can go through and actually set the right length of slot in here for the joints. And initially I moved the entire setup, but I quickly realized that the error of my ways, and I left it set up on the other end, and I realized that all I have to do is remove the clamp that is holding the piece to the other boards, and then I can just rotate the boards through, and I can do all of the mortise that way, and then I only have to move it when I'm doing the other end, so to speak. So that's what I'm doing here. We'll get fast forward through this, and you can kind of see me rotate out pieces and flip sides. The center, the middle shelf, which is the short one that's glued together, that one is getting mortise and tenons on both sides, whereas the top and the bottom will only be on the inside, so it'll only be on one surface that it's getting those. So the center setup is basically the same as the other end, with the exception of it being in the middle instead of being on the end. So I had an anomaly here a while back. I broke one of the clamps, broke the handle broke on it, and you may have seen me earlier tightening it by hand. And so what I'm doing is I'm using the one that you tighten by hand on the one that holds everything together. Right here you'll see me have the wrong clamp. And so I put this one on and I just tighten it by hand, just pull on it and push it together. And then when this one clamps, as soon as I go to step away from it, the one of the parts of the actual arm on top breaks, and you can actually hear it, and you can see the foot that's on it kind of stick up a little bit. So to remedy the issue, I basically took the rivets or the pins that hold the arm, the bars inside of the clamp. Took those out, and I switched the arm off of the one that had the handle broke, and that way I still had one functioning clamp. So, like I said, this project liked to fight me on this, so that was my remedy. And then I just used one of my pipe clamps in lieu of not having the hand clamp that I was using before. So now that we have the mortise and tenons done, we're going to do the shelves themselves. And I had some, I believe it's 1/2-inch plywood laying around, and I'm just marking that out, and then I'm using a jigsaw to go through and just do a rough cut, basically just a general cut. Then once I get them cut out to size, then I can run them through the table saw and cut them down to the actual dimension, and kind of make them cut to fit, so to speak, so that they will fit into those frames really nicely. So here I'm just cutting, doing a rough cut, and then we can get back to the next step. And you notice that I'm using the already square edges that are on the outside of this plywood, and I'm making sure that at least 2 of the edges, if possible, are used. That way I don't have to worry about squaring everything up, and I can just use that as my guide against the fence for when I trim them. So with that 1/2-inch rabbet bit that I mentioned earlier that I picked up from Home Depot, I can go through and create rabbet joints for these shelves to sit in with minimal fuss. Basically, I got the shelf itself clamped down, and I'm just going around the outside edge, and I'm putting a 1/2-inch by 1/2-inch rabbet joint, or a groove if you, for the layman. And I'm just going around and putting those in there. That way the shelves can be set in there. And one thing that this does create is when I put this rabbet joint in here, it takes out one of the sides of the mortise. But once the shelf is put in place, and that will be glued, the shelf will serve as the support for the side of that. And one thing that I did notice when I was doing this process was that it seemed like it was chipping out a lot. It wasn't ruining any of the wood at all. It just seemed like it was having a really sloppy time with it. So at one point I tried going the opposite direction, which is basically the direction that the blade spins, so it kind of makes it want to run away from you. And it actually does a little bit, and I didn't notice it at the time, but as soon as I tried to do the other side, I noticed that it had actually walked the bit out of the chuck a little bit. It had kind of pulled it down. So I had to reseat that, remeasure, make sure I was still good, and then I could continue and finish all of these shelf insets. So, and once I have everything routed out, I'm going through with a 1/2-inch chisel, and I'm just squaring the corners so that the shelf will set in there real nicely. I don't have to worry about rounding those or anything like that. So it's a really simple process if you got a sharp chisel, and I'm using a dead blow hammer just to kind of tap it out, and you can carve it out and make it nice and square. So here I've got the plywood for the shelves, and I'm just trimming it down just so it'll be a nice fit for the cases, and it'll be nice and snug. And then we do both. I think there's one that I have to do the length on, but all the other ones it's just the side that I need to trim, and that way it fits in there really nice. And with all the shelves cut to size and all of our rabbet joints for the shelves themselves done, we can go through, and all I do is just run a bead of glue into each corner, and then when the shelf sets in there, it'll squeeze that out, and it'll do a nice glue for us, so we don't have to work it around there too much. And I did accidentally. This plywood actually has some red spray paint lines on one side of it from when I picked it up, and I put one of these in upside down, and I noticed it afterwards, so I ended up having to, I basically just went through real quick and wiped all the glue off, and flipped it over, and then put it back in the correct way. So there may be some glue on there, which will be an issue. Could potentially be an issue if they decided to stain that, but most people aren't very keen on staining plywood, so I don't think it'll be something I have to worry about. So I got my hands on some marble samples, and I'm going to use them in a different project, but I thought they worked really well for weighting down these shelves, which I put on there for while the glue sets. And then just moving on to the next stage here, we got the supports that are going to be going in, and they still had some strands of wood from when we routed them earlier. So I'm just going through with some sandpaper and buffing all that off, and then we're going to glue that in. And I actually had an issue with my camera where the battery actually ran out, and so you don't get to see the middle shelf put together, but I do get the legs glued in here, and then I set that shelf on top and I glued that in as well. And then once that was dried, we moved on to the next step, and again we're sanding these off, and then we're gonna glue them in, and that'll have the supports on the left side from your point of view, and then it'll have the shorter supports on top of that middle shelf, and then the whole top piece will go on there. And we're gonna glue all that on, and then we're gonna clamp it down and make sure everything is good and snug. and that way when the glue dries, everything's good and square, and it'll be nice and solid and support the amount of weight that we're going to have from the potential fish tank that sits on top of it, up to, I think it's 150 gallons, so it's a bunch of weight. So we just want to make sure that we have everything set right, and that the glue will set everything in the right position. Ladies and gentlemen, we got 3 shelves, and it is the right dimensions to fit a 100 to 150 gallon tank on top. I believe it's 18.5 inches deep and 72.5 inches long. So you could theoretically put 2 smaller size tanks on top, or 1 big 100 gallon. So it's nice and solid, just like I hoped she would be, able to support a lot of weight if they do end up putting an aquarium on it with a bunch of water in it. So I want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, notify of future content, and hit the bell icon as well. So thanks for watching, and tune in, and we'll see you next time.